Dave Webb is here, sitting next to Chris. We've got apologies from Jerry Hutchinson, but we know Steve Maxey is over here. We've got apologies from Izzy Seckham and Monica Fogarty, and we've got Peter Butlin, Councillor, and Sarah Duxbury in place of Monica. Jonathan Browning, and we've got Roger Douthwaite.
Yeah.
Yes, I knew I'd seen you somewhere. And then we've got apologies from Coventry. I don't think there's anybody here from Coventry. And we've got apologies from Mike Stokes in Rugby.
Afraid no substitute for Mike Stokes. It's
Right.
short notice.
Okay. I know it was a short notice apology. You couldn't come. Thank you very much. Are we agreed to accept all those? Thank you. Minutes of the meeting held on the 21st of January in Hinckley. Are those agreed as a true and correct record? Thank you very much. Are there any matters arising? Shall I just quickly go through on page 5 of the page? Page 1. Two, three, and 4. Yeah, thank you very much. Right. Item 4 then is joint committee terms of reference. Steve Maxey.
Thank you, Chair. Members will recall this coming last time, and there were a number of comments and technical changes that people wanted. So hopefully, between myself and Sarah Stephen, we made a note of all those, and the resultant document is to everybody's satisfaction. There was a discussion around the LEP voting, so we dug out minutes from January last year, which quite well the LEP got the votes that they currently have, and so we've left that as one voting and one non-voting member. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you. Any questions, any points? We've dealt with this largely at the last meeting. Okay, all agreed then? Thank you very much, Steve. Do you get such easy reports that North Warwickshire presented?
Well, until we've got through the entire agenda.
Update on progress of Memorandi of Understandings, Chris Elliott. Sorry, frequency of committee meeting. You were so quick there, Steve. I'll cross you off as well for 5.
Just generally, Chair, obviously we're all aware of the other regional partnership arrangements that there are currently in place. Also, I think as part of the discussions that we had with the term of reference, it was agreed that this committee needs to continue, but it doesn't necessarily need to continue at the rate in which it's currently meeting. This is our second meeting this year, and there was a discussion with officers as to whether or not that's still appropriate, and if not, what other pattern you want to go to. So yeah, I think probably 3 options. One is keep them as they are. Secondly, only put them in as required. Or thirdly, put them in at some date and we cancel them if need be. So you could go to a 6-month thing, or you could go to a 3 times a year. It's in your hands. So just general discussion really as to how often you think it's useful to do.
Councillor Mott?
Yes, thank you, Chair. If I refer you back to the minutes that we've just approved under the terms of reference there, it says 2.1 to develop and set economic growth strategies. And then following on from that, I believe it is very important that we continue to meet. Certainly we have planning issues and other issues that we need to keep control of and discuss. We all know how very busy we are. Just look at the apologies today, but I think a discipline of regular meetings is extremely useful and worthwhile for all of us, Chair. I would suggest we stay as we are.
Is that agreed? I mean, if there is then absolutely nothing on the agenda.
We use our common sense,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah. Does everyone agree with that? Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Steve. Okay, we are back to Chris Elliott then, item 6.
Thank you, Chair. Just an apology, saying memoranda, you're reading memoranda, I'll leave those people about first and the virtues of singular and plural which is the appropriate kind of left to be at the end of that word. But the report covers two things. They're both in a sense updates. First of all, an update in progress of the memorandum of understanding around housing. I'm not going to say anything more because that's set out in the report. Each of the local planning authorities are continuing our trek towards adoption of our local plans, and clearly there'll be a further report to come to a subsequent meeting about the eventual progress on that, because the work is still not concluded. But I don't think there's too much more to say on that, to be honest, at this particular stage. That's just for your collective information. The second bit is probably more important. That's around the memorandum of understanding on employment land. Now, we're not at the point at which there is a memorandum to put before members, but we thought that because this has not particularly been discussed before, it's worth you having a presentation to show where we are, what the issues are, and what you might have to deal with in the future. And at this point, being Chief Executive Assets Virtues, where I can now delegate towards my colleague Dave Barber and Sarah Fisher from Rugby, who are going to do a presentation for you on this subject. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can everybody read that okay as it is? Yeah. Okay. Sarah and I are going to do a little bit of a double act on this. So I'm going to talk you through a little bit of the evidence that we've been looking at as a group of policy officers across Coventry and Warwickshire. And Sarah's going to sort of talk about some of the conclusions that we're beginning to see from our analysis of that evidence base. And we're not there yet, as Chris Elliott says, we've still got work to do, but we are looking to report back to you as a joint committee at next meeting in May. So, first slide here, I think we've probably covered this in Chris's introduction, except just to remind you that Nuneaton and Bedworth have been working on their SHLA. That information has been now shared with all of the planning officers in Coventry and Warwickshire, and as a group of authorities we're working together to test the conclusions that that are arising from Nuneaton and Bedworth's SHLA. Now, we're not again in a position where we can say what the conclusions from that are, because that work is ongoing. There has been a meeting of the officers. Some thoughts, suggestions, ideas have been shared with officers from Nuneaton, and they're looking into those at the moment and looking to respond back to us. So work is ongoing across for all of the councils in Coventry and Warwickshire to look at that housing capacity issue for Nuneaton and Bedworth. And clearly then that has, the outcomes of that work has implications for the housing memorandum of understanding, and that is, again, once that work is complete, something that we will need to work on and report back to you in due course. But as Chris Elliott said, the main purpose that Sarah and I here are really to talk about the employment memorandum of understanding. A little bit of context before getting to the actual evidence. First of all, employment land needs to be understood in the context of the long term and the bigger picture. We can't just think of Coventry and Warwickshire in isolation. We do need to understand the long-term context of what might happen over the next 20, 30, 40 years, and also in the context of what's going on in the whole of the West Midlands, the whole of the Midlands, if you think of the Midlands Energy. So we will keep an eye on that, and we'll need to continue as those processes like the Combined Authority, the Superset, as work is done to sort out the Birmingham housing shortfall, we will need to continue to stay light on our feet, I guess, to make sure that we do maintain a sensible balance between housing and employment growth. But that's not what we're going to be dealing with in the employment land memorandum of understanding we'll talk about now. We're aware of it, we've got that part of context, but specifically what we're trying to do at the moment is to make sure that the employment land memorandum of understanding strikes a balance with the housing memorandum of understanding. So we're not actually getting drawn into the uncertainties and the complications that could arise if we do look too far ahead and too wide. We do want to get to a point where we can progress our local plans, our core strategies in Coventry and Warwickshire. And we do already have a sound basis on which to do that and on which to move forward. So we are looking, as I say, at balancing employment land memorandum of understanding with what's already been agreed in housing memorandum of understanding. The second bullet point there is perhaps the one I want to pick out here. The objective of the memorandum of understanding as we're proposing is to ensure that the employment land needs of Coventry and Warwickshire are actually met in full, so that we have the right kind of employment land, the right amount of employment land in the right locations to meet the needs of businesses, large and small, that want to either expand in the sub-region or move into the sub-region. So that's really where we're trying to get to, is to make sure that the right employment land, the right quantum and the right type of employment land is available. So, we've already covered that, but I'm going to talk now about the evidence base, and then I'll hand over to Sarah to talk about the employment requirements and the employment capacity. Again, this is by way of context, this slide really, but it is worth being aware that the Coventry and Warwickshire evidence base that I'm about to talk about in the next couple of slides sits within the context of a West Midlands employment land study that was published in the autumn last year, undertaken by sorry, I've got it written down, but undertaken by PBA and JLL, and it was commissioned by the West Midlands Local Authority Chief Executives. Really, the findings from that were that there is a need for additional significant sites for manufacturing and logistics, but not so much for offices. And the report goes in and looks at the kind of locations and the kind of facilities that those sites need to have to provide the right kind of employment land to meet the needs. So they need to be served by rail if they're logistics sites. We need to be thinking about single user sites in attractive locations, certain locations such as the Golden Triangle of the M6, M6905, which is identified as a particular focus for some of that. And importantly, we need to have a supply that is shovel ready to go, so we can be responsive to what happens. And this is a West Midlands wide study, so it is really important that their findings are at a West Midlands level fairly consistent with what I'm about to say about what we're finding at the Coventry and Warwickshire level. During 2014 and 2015, the LEP commissioned two studies. There was the Atkins study in 2014 and the CBRE study in 2015. Some of that was triggered by the Coventry Gateway planning application, the need for an evidence base to that, and also then subsequently the refusal of that application and the inspector's specific comments about the quality of the evidence base. So the CBRE study in particular sought to address the inspector's concerns about the evidence that's out behind the Coventry Gateway study. Having said that, I think it's really important, regardless of whether there was a planning application that needed to be addressed or not, it is really important that we do have a sub-regional employment land evidence base, because we actually do need to understand the whole variety of types of employment land we need, the quantum of employment land we need, and the locations of it, and the variations across the sub-region. So I think those studies do provide us with a very useful evidence base. The CBRE study, and actually this was not inconsistent with the Atkins study, identified a need for one or possibly two additional strategic employment employment sites. So we're talking about, strategic, we're talking about 50 hectares or more, so fairly large. And ideally those should be close to the city's boundaries, close to Coventry boundaries, because that was identified as being the place where actually employment needs are strongest and the transport needs are also strongest. It was one or two additional employment sites, partly because there was some uncertainty in the CBRE work about the status of the Stratford allocation of Gaven Light Warren Heath, about whether that constituted a sub-regional employment land site or not. So that just explains why it was one or two. So the reports also concluded that the sub-regional economy will suffer if we don't actually address those issues. And importantly, there was real concerns in the CBRE study about the lack of supply that's available now. So quite a lot of the supply that we've got on our horizons is not going to be available for, say, 5 years or so. And there was a real concern raised in the CBRE report about short-term supply issues. Then, sitting alongside that, each local authority has done local employment land reviews, and they've generally all been done by the same firm, GL Hearn, so there's some level of consistency about the methodology that's being used to do that. They're all reasonably up to date as well. Some are being completed as we speak, but all of them are fairly recent. The interesting thing when you add all of all of those studies together in terms of the quantum of employment land and generally in terms of the nature of our employment land, is there's actually a lot of consistency between what is coming out of those studies and what the CBRE report is saying. So we're actually in quite a reasonable place in terms of the evidence base, pointing in the direction of the need for a quantum of employment land, which Sarah will talk about in a moment, and broadly speaking, the timescales and the type of employment land that's needed to support that. Sarah.
So, that takes us to what we think our employment land requirements are across Coventry and Warwickshire. And these numbers come from those local level employment land reviews that Dave has been referring to. Broadly speaking, these numbers in the first number column are for roughly the same plan period, so the 2011 to 31, North Warwickshire on a slightly shorter plan period than that at the moment, but roughly speaking we're talking about the same time frame, and that's all local level evidence that each of us as individual authorities is relying on as part of plan making. And as David said, if you add it all together, it provides us with a good indication of what we require across Coventry and Warwickshire as a whole. So, bringing all of that together in terms of a conclusion of what we think we need across Coventry and Warwickshire, we can see from the market's perspective that we have a lack of availability of employment land across Coventry and Warwickshire in the short term, and that's supported by the LEP's work and an issue that as authorities and as a collective we do need to be looking at. We need to, as planning authorities, work with our colleagues at the LEP and also at the County Council to make sure that we understand that market signals evidence that the market can give us in more detail. National planning policy guides require us to do that. We think we could get better at it. So one of the things that we think we could include in this MOU is a commitment that we will work to make sure we understand market signals and market demand and what we're being told about that perspective as best we can. But as I've said, the other employment requirement conclusion we can come to is that what we understand from each individual local level study can be put together to give us a quantitative understanding of what we need across Coventry and Warwickshire from an employment perspective. So that brings us next to what our capacity across Coventry and Warwickshire is in order to meet that employment need. And what we know from the plan making processes that are going on is that the only authority who has an issue with meeting their employment requirement is Coventry City. The local plan consultation that the City Council have just run that closed a couple of weeks ago indicated that there is space within the City Council, 241, no, that's wrong, for less than the 369 hectares, and giving a shortfall of 241 hectares. So that brings us then to the scope of what this MOU needs to do. We need to identify the employment land requirements that we have across Coventry and Warwickshire, but we also need to go through a redistribution exercise in order to address the shortfall that's been identified by Coventry City Council. Those two things together will allow us to get to a position where, as a group of planning authorities, we have been able to meet the employment needs of the sub-region within the sub-region, as we have attempted to do through the housing MOU. As I've said, we also think this MOU could include reference to committing us to improve our market intelligence and make sure that we understand market signals properly. So, as an officer group, that's moved us on to starting to have a look at this redistribution issue, and we've got some conclusions emerging that we're updating you on now, but obviously more work to do in order to completely draft the MOU. So our starting point when looking at redistribution of a shortfall from the city is the same with as housing was, and it's about aligning the two things together. It's about trying to make sure that we have a good balance across Coventry and Warwickshire of housing and employment provision. So on that basis, we've been able to create a methodology that would allow for the same indicative employment distribution that we saw in the housing MOU. So you remember that we were able to talk about the percentages of a shortfall that would be allotted, if you like, to each district in Warwickshire, and we could use that same methodology to have a look at how the employment could be redistributed. And on the face of it, that will provide a very consistent redistribution of housing next to employment and allow us to align those two things. However, we also have to make sure that we've considered the other areas of national planning policy guidance and of the market signals that we understand as we're looking at how we would redistribute employment. And the top ones are those that we've really put some focus on are locational issues and strategies that may be existing across Coventry and Warwickshire on that point, what the existing employment market is looking like and the characteristics of the labour force that we have. So we have this methodology, but we think it needs to be a little bit more sophisticated and maybe take account of a few more things. One of the important things that's listed on that slide, therefore, is the current commitments we already have. Generally speaking, we're talking about a plan period from 2011 to 2031. We have had employment permissions and completions in that time. So we need to take those into account when we're looking at what the shortfalls are and how we move things forward. So as I said, we understand that the Coventry shortfall is 241 hectares, but since 2011 we have had commitments and completions within Coventry and Warwickshire that could be addressing that shortfall. The first two listed there, Anstey Park and Pro Lodges Brighton, are both located in Rugby Borough, and it's been established in planning policy in Rugby Borough in agreement with Coventry City Council that those two employment sites, whilst in our borough, in Rugby Borough, and whilst obviously going through the planning system there, are meeting employment needs that are generated in Coventry City. So Rugby Borough has not been counting those two sites as meeting its employment need, they're about meeting the Coventry employment need. So they're therefore addressing this shortfall that's been identified by the City Council. Another commitment, as it were, that's coming through the planning process in the moment in the Warwick District Plan is the Coventry Gateway. And there's hectares of employment land there that can be attributed to Coventry or the wider Coventry and Warwickshire area, and therefore assisting with addressing the shortfall. So there's 3 sites there that are commitments or completions that are addressing the shortfall, and that's already happened. So to use the percentages or the statistical methodology that we have applied to the housing MOU would not be taking account of the fact that these commitments have already happened. We already have a redistribution that's begun to take place because of agreements that have already existed. What we're left with then is a shortfall of about 27 hectares that, as a group of authorities, we need to have a look at if we're going to be able to make sure that employment need across Coventry and Warwickshire as a whole has been met in full. So our next steps, we think as a group of officers, are to look at this, look at those conclusions, make sure that we're happy with them, but also to now begin to test some redistribution options now we've been able to get this far. We want to always be mindful of aligning our housing MOU with the employment MOU. We need to think about what the market will be doing, travel to work patterns, all of that large body of evidence that we have about activities and patterns in Coventry and Warwickshire. And so we've come up with a timetable in which we'll be able to take all of that account and move ourselves forward. We're in the process as a group now of really confirming the extent of that employment land shortfall. and beginning to test some redistribution options. We then would like to have a look at, in tandem with that, this idea of improving our market intelligence and market signals so that we can be preparing a draft MOU that covers the scope I've outlined in the next couple of weeks in early April. We then have another members' reference group meeting scheduled for later on in April, so as we have done with this presentation, we'll be able to present our draft to that group and receive some feedback, and we hope that that would allow us to be putting a draft MOU in front of this group into May that we can be looking at endorsing over the summer. So that's it. Any questions?
Probably out of my ignorance really, but is there a link between number of jobs reality and the amount of employment plan?
Yes, there is.
And therefore density of employment related. So you can go for more dense employment and need less land.
Yeah, all of those calculations obviously change according to the sector of employment land that you're looking at. So we know what the market would like to be providing in Coventry and Warwickshire and states that there is a demand for, and so if you're looking at those sectors, you come up with a density and an amount of land. We obviously have ideas as authorities about the type of employment land that we'd like to see on urban areas, and so that might change those assumptions. It's not an exact science, but
that's
there are.
What's driven the numbers. That's what's driven the requirement.
Yes, I mean it's all about the sort of demographic projections that go through the housing evidence. There's also jobs growth projections, and yet you have to try and translate that into a land requirement.
Okay.
Councillor Butler?
Yeah, when it comes to duty Scotland, we talked about how our authorities inside Warwickshire and Coventry. What about the A5 and the kind of going to straighten it slightly over the border when you consider the dirt, the various of the kind of back areas like that? They provide us with some of the Coventry road stuff in terms of employment land, and it's easy to deliver. So is that being taken into account?
We have met with representatives of Leicestershire and Harbour District, which is where Magna Park is, in the last couple of weeks. That meeting was mainly about the Magna Park proposals and what they thought the impact of those was, more than our shortfall. And obviously that there's Daventry and Northamptonshire as well. I think what we would probably suggest as an officer group is that we focus on whether our employment needs can be accommodated within Coventry and Warwickshire. If we identify that they can't, then we look to other areas. And I do think we would have to have ruled out being able to meet them in Coventry and Warwickshire as a sub-region first. Because, to look at it the other way, that's the message we would give Leicestershire or Northamptonshire if they were in the same position as us, that they needed to be able to test their own capacity before they look to other places. It's, as Dave said at the beginning, those sub-regional sites are an interesting piece of context for us. They're not insignificant, and their impact on employment in a sub-region wider than ours is something we need to keep an eye on. But we want to test the capacity of Coventry and Warwickshire first before we look into other areas.
And those applications, particularly in Magna Park, are being considered at the moment, need to be understood in the context of Leicestershire's employment land evidence as well. And that's what we met with them about, to understand, well, what are your employment land needs? How does that quantum of employment land affect your housing requirements in Leicestershire and so on, to make sure that yes, they're on our border as a sub-region, but to make sure there's nothing there that's going to trip up the balance that I talked about at the beginning between our housing and our employment. And I think we're satisfied that that's not going to trip us up at the moment. But you're right, there could be opportunities in the long run.
Councillor Saint?
Mr. Chairman, as we've been reminded in that presentation, most of us are on plan period starting in 2011, 5 years ago, and I recognise the figures for my authority that were in the slides, which is Dave's relieved about that. But what I was going to say was, they were from an employment land study that we commissioned by her in 2011, right? Since then, the world's moved forward. And I'd like to just reflect upon one or two things. Part of our employment land or employment land delivery in Stratford will depend upon reuse of old employment sites. But the planning inspectorate have this habit of allowing developers to actually convert those into housing land sites. Obviously it happens in Rugby, looking at Ian Davis's reaction, but the situation is
so actually. I think that's the sun issue.
It's not used to it.
well, I'll assume he's listening to what I'm saying. But anyhow, the serious thing is, that what I'm saying is we have lost some employment there. We've also gained some. Now, one of the most frustrating issues over our local plan development in Stratford was this time last year when the inspector, having done an EIP, came back to us like he did, or like they did, to just about the whole rest of the universe, the whole country, and somebody decided that they had to invent a reason why we had to put more housing supply into our local plan. What they did was, they said, right, you recommission another study, which we did. We moved away from her by this time and onto ERM, but it doesn't matter. We had the study done, and I think that study is accepted. And that study said, okay, your Coventry and Warwickshire LEP has got an economic plan, and that economic plan is going to drive more jobs, more population than you'd allowed for when you started collecting your evidence base in 2011. So up we then put our housing numbers. We've also allocated more housing line, which has just been land, which has just been through a supplementary EIP. So the plan that we are hopeful of adopting now, later this summer, is going to be, or relate to figures that are different from the 2011 figures and reflect the fact that the world is moving on. And I'm concerned with the ambitions from what's called the 3-LEP set now, which is being developed, that this might actually make decisions for us over which we have little control. So what I'm sort of saying is, fine, where is this employment land leading us to? I don't mind if it finds us stuff, but if I'm going to suddenly find that somewhere in the world they'll turn around, some planning inspector, some smart aleck is going to say, oh, but Stratford District Council, you can't turn down this housing application, even though it's where you don't want it and it exceeds your OAN, simply because somebody somewhere has said you've got to have more employment facilities. Now that means that we're not in control and our strategic documents don't put us in control. So what I need to know, the dynamics of change is something I would like to see in the way forward and in the assessments that we now see, rather than reliance on 2011 figures, which are clearly out of date.
Shall I try and answer some of that? I mean, it kind of doesn't need answering in a way, in the sense that I would agree with what you've said. I think it's really important that we do use the most up-to-date information. Now, as you'll know, your planning manager, planning policy manager, works very closely with us on this and, and ensures that whatever is done in the employment memorandum of understanding doesn't. Nothing in here is intended to cause any trouble to any of the local plans that are currently being developed or being adopted. In fact, the whole purpose of this is to actually support the development of local plans in this area. So I think the evidence that you've more recently collected is very much part of the thinking. The changes that are going on in terms of employment land, some employment land being lost for housing, that's definitely included in a lot of the figures that Sarah showed. I mean, I know in Warwick District we've made an allowance in our figures for some employment land to be lost to housing. Therefore, we need some additional employment land somewhere else. So and I know other councils are doing similar things. So we are thinking about this sort of changing dynamic that's going on. One thing we have, as I said in the introduction at the beginning, one thing we have drawn a line on is trying to anticipate too much about what might happen with a superset or something that is not yet set in stone and something that is on such a large scale. Because if we start waiting for things like that and start trying to plan for things like that, it'll get really complicated complicated, and that's not going to help us get our local plans in place, which is what we need locally. So hopefully, we're alive to the fact that our local evidence base is changing, local circumstances are changing, but we are not planning the MOU to take account of something that's out there and too big and too complex for us at the moment.
Any other?
I was wondering if it's possible that it's obviously very difficult to find land in the first place, but when you find a piece of land, and I'm thinking of Magna Park, and even when you go down to Dirt or something like that, or you'll build till you fill the gap that you've found, and that won't necessarily mean that the work's there or the houses are there. If you take Dirt and you put 5 million square feet of extra buildings down there, that I believe is being built because there's 5 million square feet of extra space. That's not necessarily in a plan, it's about taking the numbers and plonking them on the ground somewhere. Isn't there a problem then with, because that is a bit in the middle of nowhere to a certain extent, where do the houses come to support that and the other services? How do people get them?
They're the sort of locational issues that we need to take account of in this MOU as best we can at the moment. But because what it's doing is supporting each individual local plan for the time being, it's sort of for those plans to have thought about those issues. If we end up in a situation where we're doing more joint planning, then across Coventry and Warwickshire, we would think about those issues. The numbers that we've got here as far as requirements are concerned are about demographic and jobs growth projections. They're not what the market has found a space for and would like to inhabit, because that would be much higher, I suspect, than the requirements that we've got here. So that sort of planning of the jobs and the houses being in the same place is something that the local plans will do, and we want to be mindful of the housing and the employment MOU being able to sit alongside each other to assist with that process as much as possible. But the MOUs are sort of going to sit a bit above plans at the moment to inform them, and that's a plan making issue for each individual local plan.
Anyone else? Can we thank you then for the presentation? Do you want to add anything, Chris?
No, just the recommendations are is obviously just to note progress on both of the memorandums, and we'll also report back afterwards to the meetings.
Okay, thank you. Right, come back then to Steve Max.
Thank you, Chairman. Obviously, members will recall that various commitments over the years have been made to Coventry, Warwickshire, a single spatial plan with junior to our college of Hinckley. It is just Coventry, Warwickshire, unless they make it to come in as well. But notwithstanding those commitments, I think it's still worth, as the report says, revisiting this whole issue, because obviously a lot has moved on, as has been said in the last item, to review what really is the best way forward to hit what is the primary objective, which is the planning of our housing and employment needs across Coventry and Warwickshire. And as we've heard through just about every item, the number one priority is clearly adoption or review of plans. This will have an impact on that priority for the area. And of course, if you are progressing the MOUs on housing and employment, you've got the building blocks for a common approach to a very large extent anyway. So the key you can see then is that how do we progress work towards a single spatial strategy within that context, i.e. without disrupting the plans that are our top priority. And the suggested way forward in the report is that we commission some consultants to help us with the report, setting out that business case. So we're not committing to a special strategy over and above what we've done already at this meeting, but it will report on that business case and then also on the various options for that single special strategy that can be done in a number of ways. And then secondly, to commission some resource so that we don't divert from our planned work to proceed however we agree to set that forward with this business case. So, as the report suggests, if there is a council that happens to have the officers that have been seconded, and that's unlikely given the context that we've set out a number of times, then we'll need to commit around £5,000 per council split left to take this work forward in the way it's set out in the report. So the report will the first stage of that will be to report back here on that business case and then take the work forward from that.
concept of the MEP suddenly decided it could take over all the responsibilities on strategic planning from the local planning authorities. But effectively this proposal doesn't do that. It comes back in what I think Monica Fogarty once described as a collection or an amalgam of some of our local plans that we've got being developed in each of the planning authorities, and actually looking at the overall sub-regional picture because of that. But given that everybody's at a different phase of development, when would we like to see a timetable for some of this work, if we can give it a go-ahead? Perhaps we can do that in this form. Certainly I wouldn't support a statutory SSS, because as the research has shown, that's going to be hugely complicated. But a non-statutory SSS, where we actually pool our evidence, we pool our plans, and therefore get a picture of the sub-region, is eminently supportable. But given that we're all at different stages, North Warwickshire have adopted theirs, hopefully ours will come on board soon. I didn't think Warwick were too far behind us, but I'm not sure about that compared to something that Andrew said earlier. You know, given that Rugby have got to make theirs NPPF compliant, you know, there are issues which meant that there could be holes in the plan as it's developed. How are we going to deal with that?
I think Councillor Sainz rightly drawn one of the points about simply doing an amalgam of existing plans is that, you know, we're not all in the port at the same time. And who knows, I mean, those of us who are further on down the pipeline already know how your plan can keep changing. Even if you think
Yes, it does, yes.
yeah, even if you think that you're at kind of at the point of the finishing line, things keep changing. So I think that one of the things about bringing together what we've already got is fine, but you need to remember, of course, that actually it has no effect. If it's not a statutory plan, it's not a statutory plan. You can't use it in the same way that you can with a statutory plan to have effect in terms of either allowing or turning down planning applications. So you need to understand that in effect, yes, we can show to the wide world, look, we've got one plan, fine, but what use is it in practical terms other than PR? Actually, pretty low. The issue and more difficult bit is about a joint statutory plan. Now, that's has been talked about before, and I think one of the things we're simply saying here is this is not at all to stop any of the work that each of the local authorities are already doing. That would be unwise in the extreme. This is about, and this is, I'm afraid to say, on my planning background, the fact that no adopted plan ever gets to the end of its life without being reviewed or potentially replaced. So actually what you're talking about is not this plan, you're talking about the next one, or rather the process for it. And that's what you have to be mindful of. Now, about 10% of the local authorities in England have done a joint core strategy or a joint spatial plan. It is not as unusual as we think. It's unusual to us because we haven't done it. But it is quite common in other parts of the country, and it's particularly when you look at where it's done, it is often quite common where you have a large urban area, not necessarily a city, but a large urban area, which has got tightly drawn boundaries, and it has cross-boundary development issues. And you can understand why, in those circumstances, those groups of authorities have chosen that route. And we know, if you like, to our cost, the difficulty that we have. So this is, I suppose, is to think ahead, not for these current plans, but moving forward. What's the right approach? Bearing in mind, if you can think about it, the cost that each local authority here has had to pay out over a number of years in order to pursue its own local plan. Now, we've all done that for the very best of intentions, but the reality is, will we next time be able to afford that? All collecting separate evidence. or having groups of teams of people writing policies that might not actually be that very different. Now, it's not about trying to change the political control of it, but it is about the process of collecting evidence and actually how we do it. So I think what we're trying to say here is let's look at that, let's be a bit forward thinking. It doesn't mean at all that we do a joint statutory single special strategy, but let's look at the options. There are indeed a number of ways to do it. Nottingham City and the districts around it did what they call an aligned approach. So they each had their separate local plan, but they had a joint inquiry. Or most of them did. They reckon that saved them about £500,000 in terms of that process. Now I know from our authority that if we go through the whole of our local plan story, which about 2010 feels an awful lot longer, we have probably expended hundreds of thousands of pounds in terms of taking the local plan forward. Now, I'm not saying everyone was dealing at the same level, but if you aggregate it all, we are talking about an awful lot of public money going into something. And clearly, in all of these very testing times that we're facing, we should we not, see whether or not we can achieve the same or better outcome with a better use of the resources that we have to have. So, this is for the future. This isn't for now. But we have to plan for the future, starting now.
Can I suggest from the chair that we look at the possibilities further, because a single sheet of A4 doesn't effectively look at that possibility. And I think we all need to look at this from an individual authority point of view a little bit more carefully. So I would be a little concerned about accepting some of the recommendations without looking a little bit closer at this first.
I think, Chairman, I would support that, because what Chris Elliott is telling us, there are longer term objectives here that haven't been mentioned in this paper. Clearly, it wasn't thought necessary, but the arguments are opening up. And I do know the planning officer that Mr. Barber referred to, that keeps in touch with from my authority, did give me a briefing note on this when this was first put in, because he was aware, through his past experience, of Worcester and the two adjacent districts in Worcestershire, dealing with a joint core strategy. And as their neighbours of mine, I've probably talked to the leaders there more often than others in this room, and I think there was a considerable gnashing of teeth along the way. It's an attractive idea, as Chris Elliott says, to save money. And I should think we all have spent a considerable amount of money on it. And every time there's a hiccup or a review or a change of bloody rules or protocols or whatever, we end up spending more money and a few more months get further away from adoption, which is hardly satisfactory. But we do have to recognise our responsibilities. What we can pull is fine. But if we're saying to ourselves, well, we've really got an ambition to change things in the long term, we do need that declared, I think, early on. Why do you say?
Steve?
That's it. Then, in fact, you the first bit of that we're doing, which is the business case around what are the options and what are the implications and how far forward you go, that you allow us then to do that first bit. That will still require a contribution unless then we can put some staffing resource in. So we keep the financial contribution, but we stop simply at the business case stage, if you like, for that more detailed report to come back. It's not in here because this is a report saying we need resource to get that in there. So that's what we're not there. It's asking for that first stage to go and get some help, get some resource, bring forward that business case about why would you do this and if so, in what way, and then you can set out various timescales and the further work that must do.
Okay, I do have some concerns that Coventry isn't here. I know that's Coventry's own decision, that there is nobody from Coventry. But we are making decisions here that affect the whole of this area, and I'm a little concerned about making decisions that Coventry don't actually put their hand up to.
Yes, I agree with your comment initially about 2 pages of A4, and I also agree with what's been said. And I would hope that we can agree the recommendations, but the scope of work and what comes back to us, final approval would it be May? That would be by May, and then there'll be a much lower cost, and then we can decide the way forward there. That would be. So I support both of you, but support the sort of revision of these approaches.
Any other councillor?
Yeah, I think just from a Hinckley Bosworth point of view, we just need to understand a little bit more about whether we can fit in with this. Because I know at the moment it doesn't actually mention us in the text, but whether we could fit in with that and what the implications would be for us on that. So I think it needs a little bit more thought. But if that could be explored as well in the sort of time scale, I think it would be good.
Yeah, I think we can see where it's going, and I think there's a consensus emerging. But the report here starts talking about requiring a budget. So are these proposals of further exploration, which I think is what is being suggested in one guise or another by all the last 3 or 4 speakers? Not a question of necessarily agreeing the recommendations, but exploring the way forward. Would there be a financial commitment like this suggests to do that?
If I may,
So I don't know that I can sit here and even, commit our council to a share of whatever it is, 40k.
Well, if I just said, I think you've got 2 options on how you go forward. Either you just bring a scoping report back saying, this is how much it will cost, this is how much it will cost to do the business case, this is how much it will be to do whatever it is you decide on that. Option 1. Option 2 is you agree the financial commitment to do the business case, and the next report you get then is about the business case, about how you go forward. So if you choose one, then you won't need to put any financial commitment in now. We'll get a tender done and to bring that to you. The second option does require a smaller financial contribution because they're going to do the business case. Now you can stop at 1, and we can see if outside the meeting people are happy to put in a couple of £1,000 to progress it to the business case. It's up to you. So you can either stop and just bring the whole brief commission back here for the next meeting, or you can authorise us with it, which is to take it through to the business case.
Well, I've raised this subject before, and I don't know the powers of other people in the room, but I don't have the power to spend money without going back to some consultation. And I certainly can't spend money for Coventry, but it's not yet. Not yet. Chris?
Chairman, may I make a suggestion? If we just looked at the first bullet point, so if we said, as officers, we would go away, draw up a scope of work, and set out a brief. So it's not a business case, but just a brief. And then, in the meantime, we'll try and get a better handle on what that might cost be. Then if we do that, then we'll come back to you at the next meeting in May. That way, at this stage, all you're committing is some officer time in order to be able to do that.
Are we all happy with that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think Hinckley's case does need to be taken into consideration. But if they, just technically, I only have to walk over the road and I'm in Hinckley, and I have a very long way to go to Stratford.
Yeah. So you keep telling me, Chairman, especially when we invite you there at 9 o'clock in the morning.
No, that's an impossibility. We shall look tomorrow because we've got the police and crime panel here tomorrow morning, so we'll hope the Stratford representative is here on the dot at 9 o'clock.
He told me earlier, Chairman, he would be coming. And he got into Stratford this morning an hour before anybody else did, so that's a good omen. Good.
Okay. Are we agreed on that then? Those who are here. Could we make a point to Coventry? I'm not going to start hating Coventry in this sense, but that it would be helpful to have a representative from Coventry when it is the Coventry, Warwickshire and Hinckley Bosworth It's very difficult to discuss without Coventry. Do we have any other, with no other matters of public business, I think, that's on the agenda? So we agreed exclusion of the public and press for the private business in terms of exempt information.
Yeah,